He said it loud enough for the entire open plan office to hear. 14 people at their desks, 2 interns by the printer, and a glass-walled meeting room full of colleagues who all suddenly found their laptops extremely interesting. And what he said was, "Honestly, I don't know why we keep putting Sarah on client-facing work. She's just not built for it." And I was standing close enough to him that I could have touched his sleeve, holding a folder with 6 weeks of my research inside it, and I did not flinch. I did not cry. I did not say a single word, because something in me went very quiet and very certain in that moment, the kind of certain that doesn't need an audience. Right, so welcome back. Honestly, I'm so glad you're here for this one because this story has been sitting in my chest for a long time and it feels good to finally let it out. Grab whatever you're drinking, get comfortable, drop a comment when something hits you, and if you're new here, just know this channel is where real stories about real moments get told without any sugarcoating. So hit subscribe and let's get into it. My name is Sarah Calloway. I work in brand strategy. I'm based in Edinburgh, and for 3 years I worked at a mid-sized agency called Meridian Creative, where I was, without any exaggeration, responsible for some of the strongest client relationships the company had. Not because I was lucky, not because I was charming in some vague, undefined way, but because I actually listened to clients. I remembered what they told me. I read the brief properly. I asked the questions that other people skipped because they were in a hurry to sound clever. And I delivered work that made sense for their business, rather than work that looked impressive in an agency portfolio. That distinction matters more than most people in this industry want to admit. My boss was a man named Greg Halford. Director level, been at Meridian for 9 years, had the confidence of someone who confuses tenure with talent, and operated with the particular energy of a man who had reached a comfortable position and was primarily interested in staying there. Greg was not a bad person in the way that makes someone easy to dislike. He was the more complicated kind of difficult, the kind who gives you enough praise to keep you engaged and enough dismissal to keep you small, and who has probably never once sat alone and thought carefully about the effect he has on other people because the thought has simply never occurred to him as necessary. He didn't dislike me personally. I think that's actually the part that stings most looking back. He just didn't take me seriously, and he had no idea he was doing it, which somehow made it worse than if it had been deliberate. The morning he humiliated me in front of the office started normally, which is how most days that change everything tend to start. We had a full team meeting at 9 to run through the Alderton account, a national retail brand that had come to Meridian 6 months earlier and had been, to put it diplomatically, not particularly happy with the work so far. Alderton was mine. I'd been the one to sit in on every briefing, the one who'd flagged early that the creative direction was missing the brief, the one who'd quietly rebuilt the strategy document when the first version came back from the client covered in polite but pointed feedback. I'd been working on a revised positioning paper for 3 weeks, something I hadn't officially been asked to do, but had done anyway because the account needed it and I could see what it needed. Greg opened the meeting by talking about Alderton in the way he always talked about accounts that weren't going well, with a kind of weary frustration directed outward rather than inward, as though the problem existed in the client rather than in the work. He said the relationship needed stronger senior oversight, which in agency language means someone above you is about to step in and take the wheel of something you've been steering, usually right before it finally starts working. I said I had been developing a revised strategic framework and would like to walk the team through it. Greg looked at me the way people look at someone who has spoken slightly too soon in a conversation they weren't quite invited into, not unkind, just a fraction of a second too slow to take me seriously. He said, "Let's park that for now, Sarah." He then turned to Marcus, a senior strategist who had been on the account for approximately 3 weeks and had attended 2 of the 6 client calls, and asked Marcus to share his thinking on where the account was heading. Marcus shared his thinking. It was fine. It was the kind of thinking that sounds thorough in a meeting and dissolves when you put it next to an actual client brief. Nobody challenged it, because Greg was nodding, and when Greg nods, people stop questioning. After the meeting, in that specific, horrible, open plan way where conversations happen at full volume because the speaker has simply never learned to read a room, Greg said it. The line I already told you at the start of this story. Loudly, casually, the way you'd comment on the weather. Honestly, I don't know why we keep putting Sarah on client-facing work. She's just not built for it. I heard it. The interns heard it. The account manager at the desk behind me heard it, and I know she did because I saw her go completely still. I picked up my folder and walked back to my desk and opened my laptop, and for about 4 minutes I stared at a document without reading a single word of it. And then something shifted in me from hurt to focused, which is a gear change I've learned to trust. Because every time that shift has happened in my life, something useful has followed. I did not go to HR that day. I want to be honest about why, and the reason is not that I was afraid. The reason is that I had something better to do first, and I needed Greg and Meridian to see exactly what they dismissed before any formal conversation happened, because I wanted the record to be completely clear about who knew what and when. I went home that evening, finished the positioning paper, and sent it to the client directly, copying Greg as a professional courtesy, with a note explaining that this was the revised strategic framework I'd been developing and that I'd welcome a call to discuss it when they had time. I want to say I did this with enormous calm and strategic calculation, which is partially true, but I also did it because I was sitting at my kitchen table at 9:30 at night, slightly furious and completely clear-headed, and that combination in me tends to produce some of my best work, which is probably something a therapist would find interesting. The client responded the next morning. Not to Greg, to me. Her name was Rachel Alderton. She was the head of marketing for the brand, and she had been politely frustrated with Meridian for 4 months without ever quite saying so in direct enough terms for Greg to register it as a problem rather than a tone issue. She read the positioning paper overnight, and her email arrived at 7:48 in the morning, before I was even at my desk, and it said, "Sarah, this is the first thing we've received that actually understands what we're trying to do. Can we get on a call this week?" Greg was copied on the email. He read it. I know he read it because his read receipt came through 11 minutes later, and he said nothing to me for the entire morning, which told me everything I needed to know about how he was processing it. By afternoon, he came to my desk, pulled up a chair, and said with the particular awkwardness of a man who needs something from someone he's recently been careless with, "Rachel Alderton wants a strategy session Thursday. I think it makes sense for you to lead it." I said, "Of course." I did not say anything else. I did not make him acknowledge what he'd said in the open office. I did not need him to apologize in that moment because the email from Rachel sitting in my inbox was already a more accurate appraisal of my value than anything Greg could have offered, and I was focused on Thursday. The call on Thursday went well, genuinely well. The kind of session where you can feel the energy shift from polite engagement to actual excitement, where the client starts finishing your sentences, not because they're being rude, but because they're with you. They're tracking, they can see it. Rachel's team asked questions that built on the framework rather than challenged it, which is the difference between a client who's interested and a client who's looking for a way out. Greg was on the call. He said almost nothing for the first 40 minutes and then made 2 comments near the end, both of which were accurate and neither of which changed the direction of anything. After the call, Rachel sent a follow-up email to the full thread and said, "Really grateful for today, Sarah. This has given us a lot of confidence. Can we establish a regular session going forward?" Greg replied before I did, warmly, professionally, saying Meridian was delighted with the progress. He CC'd the managing director. He did not mention that he'd spent 6 months doubting the account lead who just turned the relationship around in one Thursday afternoon call. I noticed. I also noticed something else in that same week, a job listing from a strategy consultancy in Glasgow called Ashford & Line, a smaller operation than Meridian, but one with a reputation in the industry for doing genuinely interesting work with brands that cared about getting things right, rather than just getting things out the door. They were looking for a senior brand strategist. I applied on a Friday evening, attached the Alderton positioning paper as a work sample because it was the clearest example I had of how I think, and then I went to sleep and didn't overthink it, which for me is a significant personal achievement. The interview process took 3 weeks, and it was the best professional conversation I had ever been in. 2 rounds, both substantive, both run by people who asked questions that required actual thought rather than the performance of thought. And after the second session, the director, a woman named Helen Ashford, who had built the consultancy from a 2-person operation over 12 years, said to me directly, "We've seen a lot of applicants for this role, and you're the first one who came in with a case study that made us want to change how we approach a brief." I started at Ashford & Line 6 weeks later. I handed in my notice to Greg on a Monday morning, and his face did something complicated that he recovered from quickly. And he said all the correct things about wishing me well and the team being sorry to lose me. And I thanked him sincerely because I actually meant it. Because Meridian had taught me a lot, including some things it had no intention of teaching me. On my last day, Rachel Alderton sent me a personal email, not to the Meridian thread, to my personal address, which she must have found from my LinkedIn, and it said, "I heard you're leaving. I want you to know that the work you did on our account was the thing that kept us from walking. Good luck wherever you're going." They're lucky. I read it at my kitchen table with a glass of wine and I kept it. I have it still. Because some things are worth saving not as proof and not as ammunition, but simply as a record of a moment when someone saw you clearly and said so. Here's what I actually think about what Greg said that morning, and I'm not going to soften this because I think softening it would be dishonest. When someone in authority says out loud that a person is not built for something, they are not offering an assessment. They are offering a preference dressed up as a fact. And the difference matters enormously because preferences can be wrong in ways that facts cannot. And Greg's preference, delivered casually in an open office, was wrong in a way that cost him an account relationship and a strategist in the same month, which is an expensive preference to hold. I am not someone who needs public vindication to feel settled in my own ability. I knew what I was capable of before Rachel's email, before the Thursday call, before Ashford in line. What changed was not my understanding of myself, but my understanding of where I was spending that capability. And the answer was somewhere it was not being valued, which is the only kind of wrong fit that actually matters in the end. At Ashford in Line, I have been doing the best work of my career. Helen runs the consultancy in a way that makes you feel like your thinking is the point, rather than a resource to be managed. And the difference that makes to the quality of the output is something I wish I'd understood how to seek out earlier. Greg was not a villain. He was just a man who got comfortable enough to stop paying attention, and that is its own kind of professional failure, quieter than the obvious kind, but just as real. The client asked for me specifically. That's the part I want you to hold on to, not as a triumph, not as a gotcha moment, but as a reminder that when you do the work properly, when you actually listen, when you care about getting it right rather than just getting it done, people notice, even when the person sitting between you and them does not.